Okay, kids. All right. So what I want to do is that just to make sure that you maintain the context of what it is we're doing. One of the things that I want to be able to contribute here in this class is that for you to be able to maintain a strategic, tactical, as well as logistical perception or perspective on what it is that's going on now in the country. That obviously, while we keep talking about the fact that global climate change is the big major issue of the day, you keep getting overwhelmed every day with stuff about the impeachment and about all the hearings that are going on in the House of Representatives primarily, and the big debates going on about whether or not William Barr will come and testify before the House Judiciary Committee or the Oversight Committee or any others, and the other issues of the Keystone XL pipeline and the other major pipelines, the Trans Mountain Pipeline and others, are kind of quietly in the background with litigation going on, trying to stop the pipeline through the litigation process. What I'm in the process of doing is I'm explaining the connection between this ongoing impeachment process of Donald Trump and connecting it to the global climate change crisis that we're facing. And I'm going to be linking that to the uprising of the indigenous people against the pipeline up in North Dakota, and the efforts that are being made by the various oil corporations around the world to suppress the indigenous people in their area, in Africa, down in Ecuador, other places where the major oil corporations are on board and disappearing some of the organizers in the indigenous movements that are trying to challenge the threat to their water. And I'm pointing out that my thesis here is that despite the resistance to impeachment on the part of the traditional Democratic Party leadership by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and their obviously favored candidate of Joe Biden, that one ought not to impeach Trump at all. One ought to have a whole series of hearings going on rather consistently, dragging up in front of various House committees different key witnesses and getting them to go on the record stating things that have basically already been found in the Mueller report, because they're convinced that people won't read the Mueller report. And so that what they want to do is they want to dramatically reenact the testimony of a number of key witnesses that were interviewed by Mueller that caused him to come to the conclusions he did. But what I'm saying is that despite that tactical decision that has been made by the traditional leadership of the Democratic Party, that the new progressives in the Congress are pressing for impeachment. And they've now been reinforced in that demand by people such as Lawrence Tribe at Harvard University, the ranking constitutional scholar in the country. And he's come forward saying that to allow Donald Trump to get away with what he's been doing and not impeach him is going to establish such a horrible precedent that it will be impossible for either political party to recover from this and actually mount an effective impeachment against any president, no matter how awful they might be, assuming that they could be worse than Trump has been, which is quite an assumption. But the fact is that there are demographics that I want to have you have the opportunity here in this class to get to know about that you might not otherwise know about, that even though the Democratic Party shifted the control of the House of Representatives, there are 435 members in the House, and there used to be approximately 240 Republicans and 200 Democrats. Now they've reshifted it, having 240 Democrats and 200 Republicans. But that 40 seat difference between the two parties now conceals the fact that there are actually 64 new Democrats in the House of Representatives. Many of the older Democrats were replaced by younger ones and more progressive members. And so the membership in the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives has gone up to 98 members that are now in the Progressive Caucus. So they're knocking on the door right now of they only need about 50 more members of the Democratic Progressive Caucus to take control of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives. So it's a key spot right now. And the fact of the matter is that Alexandria Rojas, who is the executive director of the Justice Democrats, who is a close associate with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has already announced that one of their plans is to target certain incumbent Democrats around the country who have been in office for 3, 4, 5 terms, but are not supporting really progressive legislation to stop global climate change. And so that they've seized upon this issue of global climate change and the Green New Deal as the lever that they're going to be using, or the wedge actually they're going to be using to drive into the Democratic Party to get more progressives into the Democratic Party by challenging some of these more moderate incumbents, not in red states or purple states, as they refer to them, where it's kind of a close call as to whether you're going to get a Republican or Democrat, but instead in the congressional districts that are safe districts for the Democrats, districts where they traditionally have been winning by 20, 25, 30 points consistently over the last decade in those districts, and yet they've still got these really extremely moderate to conservative Democrats in there. And what we've just found out is that the Congressional Campaign Committee, the House Campaign Committee of the Democratic Party, the DCCC, has now just issued a fatwa, basically, that if anybody in the Democratic Party works for a person who is challenging an incumbent Democrat in the House, that they're going to be forbidden from ever having a job again in the Democratic Party. Now, so you can see that they're really starting to get worried already about what it is that's going on now with the Justice Democrats. And what you're really looking at is that the Justice Democrat movement is basically a tactical decision that's been made by the Democratic Socialists, or the Social Democrats, as they're known, to not set up a separate party and not sort of shift out of the Democratic Party and go into, for example, the Green Party. You know, you could take a lot of those candidates, they could have just as easily run as a Green Party candidate, but what they're doing is they're accepting the concept that the dialectic or the bipolar debate between A team and B team is so kind of deeply ingrained in the American consciousness and psyche that unless you're a candidate for one of those two teams, you don't stand any realistic chance of winning, because everybody's going to view you as like a third-party candidate, and that it's a throwaway of your vote. So they've made a decision to come inside the Democratic Party and run as Democrats, led by, of course, Bernie Sanders, who, even though he's an independent and a Democratic Socialist from Vermont, he caucuses with the Democratic Party, and he runs for the Democratic Party nomination. And so the thesis that I'm setting forth for you is that I believe that this impeachment is likely to take place, and that it will be driven by these new, younger progressives in the Democratic Party. But this present program of pushing for the impeachment of Trump by the congressional newcomers, and to be candid about it, even by MSNBC and CNN, to be perfectly fair to Trump, is that there's no doubt at all that you tune into MSNBC and starting from 5 o'clock in the evening all the way through to midnight, one news show after another is just in the business of excoriating Trump and basically running around with their hair on fire, talking about how it's necessary to impeach this guy. So despite that kind of strong urging on the part of MSNBC and even CNN and the progressives in the Democratic Party, it's not likely that they're going to be able to succeed in doing anything other than getting him impeached in the House of Representatives. It's not likely that they're going to be able to, the progressives are not likely to be able to convince an adequate number of senators in the Republican-dominated Senate to vote to convict him. And so therefore, what's under the present set of circumstances, what's likely to happen is that the impeachment will take place in the House. He'll go up to the Senate side, but the Republicans will refuse to convict him. And the moderate Democrats are arguing that is going to give Donald Trump an actual chance of winning the election in 2020. Because if you don't succeed in impeaching him and getting him out of office, he's inevitably going to be the Republican Party nominee. And therefore, he's going to have a chance of winning, because the impeachment process will have enraged his base so dramatically, and the failure of the conviction is going to be presented by the Trump administration and the Republican Party as a demonstration of the fact that he is innocent, because that's how people perceive it. If you're acquitted in a trial, you are innocent. And if you're not, only if you're not convicted, then you were either unjustly charged, or else it was a witch hunt of some sort against you. And so that the problem is right now that this process on the part of the progressive Democrats and the more progressive television news stations to get him impeached, according to their scenario, is running the risk of having him have a real chance of winning the election. And they're going to be arguing that not only was the impeachment by the progressives the wrong thing to do because it inflamed his base and gave him this kind of victim image that he could appeal to in the campaign, but they're also going to be arguing that, look, you progressives ran so many candidates in the primary that you basically drowned out the voice of Joe Biden, who is their candidate. And they would like to have just a simple one-on-one in the Democratic primary between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, so that they could say, well, you can't vote socialist because that's going to give Trump the ability to argue that the Democratic Party is now socialist. And he's going to equate that to communism and authoritarianism in Stalin, in Nazis, and everything else. And therefore, they're blaming the progressives. They're doing everything they can do to get the progressives to stop doing this. As I say, they want to have a one-on-one between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And they don't want Joe Biden injured in the process that's going to somehow impair his ability to beat Trump. And so you can see what's happening is, well, almost all of the other 20 candidates or the 19 other candidates are kind of stepping around this question of whether they're going to be calling for immediate impeachment or not. What you see is Joe Biden is instead going right straight at Trump. in criticizing Trump and telling people that you got to get rid of Trump and he's better than Trump and it's time to have an honest president, someone that can be trusted in the international field. That Biden's theory is to go right straight at Trump, whereas almost all the other folks are talking about their policies. Let's not focus just on beating Trump. Let's talk about what we're going to do positively. Let's have the Green New Deal. Let's have health care for all. Let's have a free state public school education at the college level. Let's do these positive, concrete things. Let's not get caught just attacking Trump. So the question is, what is it that we are proposing that we do to try to prevent this type of a scenario from taking place? And what I have proposed is that we need to get past the temporary success that William Barr has had in selling this trope that, there was no evidence of any collusion. And that the real standard that has to be met is criminal conspiracy, and there's no real ability to prove beyond a reasonable doubt all of these technical conditions that you need to get to have a conviction for criminal conspiracy. And so let's just set that aside. And let's all just focus on the obstruction. Let's just focus on these 10 different candidates for obstruction, which if you turn on the news on almost any of these cable stations now, except for Fox, all you're going to do is be hearing about these 10 candidates. Here are these 10 different instances in which Trump took steps to obstruct the investigation. And they're going to be championing Don McGahn to come on to be the star witness, because he's the key witness to probably half of those incidents of the obstruction efforts, of ordering him to fire the special prosecutor, then ordering him to lie about the fact that he wasn't ordered to fire the special prosecutor, etc. So what I've proposed is that we look at the collusion, look at the evidence of the answer to this mystery that is at the core of this entire process against Trump. Is why in the world is Trump acting this way toward Putin and toward Russia? Why is he acting like that? What I propose is that we, rather than constantly drilling down on some of these tempting ones about how he was involved in laundering funds for the oligarchs through his towers, how he was in fact dependent upon the loans from the banks where the oligarchs were putting their money that they'd embezzled in Russia. And so therefore he's beholden to them in some general way. Is that I think that the two candidates that we have to take a look at to answer the fundamental question of what is the underlying mystery that explains what the love affair is that Trump has with Putin, which would justify the obstructing steps that he was taking. Because what I'm pointing out is that just to point out that he's obstructing the investigation, what's going to happen is that if that's all you have and you don't answer the fundamental question as to why it is that he was trying to cover up something, or what was it he was trying to cover up, if you can't prove that to the people, they're just going to think this is some weird technicality. That, okay, so he was refusing to cooperate, so he was obstructing, so what? If you can't prove the underlying crime that he was trying to conceal, the American people, at least a critical mass of them, are not really going to go for this. So that what I'm saying is that you really need to get down to proving what the underlying major sin is of which he was guilty that is motivating him to try to conceal, and what is motivating him to constantly be extolling Putin and excusing Putin and taking Putin's word over his own intelligence people, about even under the point of refusing to acknowledge that they were really interfering in the election. And what you hear going on now is him saying that, or all the news people saying that that no one is allowed to talk about inside the White House the fact that the Russians were attempting to intervene in the election to get him elected, no matter how much evidence there is, because he thinks that undermines the legitimacy of his election. And so he doesn't want anybody talking about it. So what he's doing is he's pushing back against the charges that the Russians intervened in the election at all, and therefore he's doing nothing about it. He's not taking any steps at all to try to exercise leadership in stopping Russia from intervening in the election in 2020 to his benefit. And so that you get this weird situation going on where there are some of the executive branch agencies, Homeland Security and FBI and others, that are trying to figure out some set of protocols to impose to protect the election in 2020 against Russian interference. But because Trump is not exercising any kind of leadership in this field, that not only are they openly inviting Russia to come in to try to assist Trump in getting elected in 2020, but others may well be tempted to come in, such as China and Iran, both of who have some fairly muscled up capacities in this area of cyber warfare. So that they may all pile on in the 2020 election. And it's perfectly evident that it's to their advantage to have Trump elected again. Not only because Trump is catering to all of the interest of Russia for whatever the mysterious reason is, but also he is so disruptive of American foreign policy, and he is so reluctant to pursue what is characterized by the intelligence community and the national security state bureaucracy as the interests of the United States all around the world, that China loves having him be there in the presidency, and Russia loves having him be in the presidency because he is such an incompetent fool. Yes, Graham?
Even in spite of the tariffs, you think Chinese support Donald Trump's presidency?
Yes. I think that what's happening is that the tariffs, while they're troublesome to China, I mean, China's sitting on holding 9/10 of all the national debt of the United States. They're not worried about some temporary, they play the long game. And there may be some temporary discomfiture on their part with these tariffs, but the fact is it's a terrible policy on the part of the United States. And it's not going to do anything to help the American economy. And that China, if you assume that China is engaged in the effort to become the primary power on the planet, which I think is a fairly safe assumption, then they're not engaged in a one-on-one head-to-head with the United States. They're not playing checkers against the United States. They're not even playing chess against the United States. They're not even playing three-dimensional chess against the United States. They're playing the game of Go, which is completely different. You just sort of lay back and you surround the adversary and just surround them and choke them off. And so that having a nincompoop like this as the President of the United States is much to their advantage as well. And all they're going to have to do is conceal their cyber attacks on our election process as Russian attacks. That's all they have to do. And they're going to be doubling and tripling the effect on the election. And the problem is that one of the tactics, as you know, that Russia adopted in its intervening in the election is to exacerbate the schisms inside our country, to exacerbate the racial issue, to exacerbate the economic disparity issue, to exacerbate the right-wing fascist skinheads issue, to point out the injustice of the American system of having disparate amounts of pay for women to men. There are enough natural fissures in the American body politic for them to recognize and to push in and wedge into those issue areas and disrupt the entire American people. That this last 2 years has been almost unlike any period since the McCarthy era in the United States. And people are all getting angry at each other. There's a whole lot of horizontal anger going on now. And so that people are taking their eye off the ball, that there's this 1% of the major corporate stockholders and management officials that are getting some 49% of all the newly generated wealth in the country. And people are getting distracted into all these other issues, in some part because of the intervention of Russia into the electoral process. And now that could be exacerbated by China and perhaps even Iran. So what I have said is that I think what we need to do is to focus on two of the potential explanations for this mystery, the big mortal sin, if you will, that's underlying the entire Trump conspiracy theories here. Is what is it that's really going on? My opinion is that if the most that you're going to be able to show is that he was in fact taking loans from the Deutsche Bank, and they were using money from the Russian oligarchs that were on deposit in the bank, that's going to be another one of those things where even Mueller wouldn't be able to find evidence enough to convict him. Because if Trump they're in a sense laundering those funds through the Deutsche Bank. They're depositing their funds, the Russian oligarchs, in the Deutsche Bank. The Deutsche Bank therefore has the authority to loan the money out. They loan the money to Trump. Trump builds the Trump Towers. He ends up paying them back the loans, and then the money is laundered for the oligarchs, and there's no fingerprints on this thing. And so if that's the relationship that he has, the relationship in which he's sort of beholden to the oligarchs, that's a little too difficult to prove a formal agreement. A formal agreement between the oligarchs and Trump that he's going to get their money loaned to him, okay? Because you've got this washing process going on with the Deutsche Bank, so that the other issue is the money laundering on the part of the oligarchs through his towers themselves, and that is he gets the loan from the Deutsche Bank. He builds 2 or 3 of these gigantic towers filled with condominiums. The Russian oligarchs come in and buy, 5 or 6, I've mentioned before, buy 5 or 6 of these condominiums for like $8 million each and turn around and sell them for $6 or $7 million at a loss, but they're laundering their money. And the fact of the matter is it's going to be very, very difficult to prove that there's any kind of criminal conspiracy going on there, because it's to the advantage of Trump to sell the condominiums, to get them all sold out. And if he's selling them to Russian oligarchs, there's no law against that. And so that neither one of those types of activities are going to be able to convince the American people that he should be impeached. Because what you're going to have to do, the secret in getting a president effectively impeached, and as you know, that none of them have been convicted. That Johnson wasn't convicted back in the 19th century, and Clinton wasn't convicted. Nixon never ended up getting convicted because he quit. And so the ability to get a president convicted in the Senate is a very difficult thing, more difficult than getting him just impeached or charged with this offense. So in order to actually get a president successfully impeached and convicted, I believe that what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to put evidence forward that in fact disempowers him from being able to govern. You have to be able to undermine his integrity and authority with the American people to the point where he cannot really govern. And there's only two of the 10, not the 10 obstruction things, but 2 of the 4 or 5 different theories as to what explains what the underlying sin is that he's trying to conceal here. The 2 of them are that with regard to the Russian interference in the election, it's going to be necessary to prove, as I mentioned before, it'll be necessary to prove that the particular polling data that was given by Manafort, that was given to the Russian spy relating to Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, was actually used by the Russians to effectively interfere with the voting in those 3 states, so as to delegitimize his actual election itself. And as you noted, that Mueller did not investigate that part. He found out about the meeting, he knew what the data was that they gave them, but he hasn't followed it up. He just assigned that investigation to the FBI. And as of yet, we haven't heard anything about that. All we know is that Mueller said that at the present time, he wasn't in possession of adequate evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the existence of some specific agreement that actually resulted in delegitimatizing the election. And so that if the FBI were to come up with proof that active steps were taken by Russia to use that polling data to actually target particular areas in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and actually, for example, penetrated the voting machines where they changed the data, that they put in all the big social media campaign to give the cover for the change in the vote, but that they actually somehow got into those machines and manipulated those votes to change it, it's going to be hard to prove that one. But it's one that would work, okay? So the other one that we're talking about right now, and the one that you haven't really heard about other than here, is this peculiar sale of the Russian National Oil Company. The purchase of Rosneft is Rosneft. The Rosneft oil and gas company, which was the government-owned oil and gas company in Russia that was sold in 2016 to these 5 different groups, 20% interest in each of them. And that we know that Qatar bought 20%. We know that ExxonMobil bought 20%. And we know that Rex Tillerson was the CEO of ExxonMobil at the time. And he was given the Friendship of Russia Award, the highest award that the Russian country ever gives to a non-Russian citizen. And then Trump made him his Secretary of State. And this would go a great distance in explaining the oil corporation cabinet that Trump put into place, not only with Rex Tillerson as the CEO of ExxonMobil, but Rick Perry is his Secretary of Energy from Texas, the oil state of Texas, who was a vice president of Sunoco Logistics, Scott Pruitt, who was the Attorney General from Oklahoma, and had filed any number of major lawsuits against the Environmental Protection Agency, putting him in charge of the Environmental Protection Agency, and then putting Eric Prince's sister in as the Secretary of Education, and Eric Prince being the CEO and founder of Blackwater International, a spinoff of which, Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation, is now the armed brown shirt operation for the major oil corporations. And then it also goes a long ways in explaining the kind of Russophile elements that were all put in the National Security Advisory Committee by Trump. Guys like Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort became his campaign chairman, but he was previously in the National Security Advisory Committee, and he was a long-time, multi-million-dollar paid lobbyist for the Russian sympathetic government in the Ukraine. and Mike Flynn and George Papadopoulos and this other fellow, but General Joseph Schmitz. These were all people put on the National Security Advisory Committee, and he was involved in selling Russian arms in the Middle East. And so that these people all show up at this small group meeting of 24 people on April 27th at the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C., when Trump made his very first foreign policy speech. And his foreign policy speech was just filled with praise for Russia and for the need to have a closer relationship and partnership with Russia. And this entire thing took place following this closed-door VIP cocktail party where 24 people were all present, almost all of whom were directly involved in the sale and purchase of the oil corporation for Russia. And that what I'm saying is that one group, there's a group, a secret Cayman Islands-based group called the Intertrust Group, that nobody knows who the fiduciaries are. Nobody knows who, in fact, are the beneficiaries of that secret trust. What we do know is that the law firm that represented them in the Cayman Islands, the Walker's law firm, is closely associated with Stephen Schwarzman, and Stephen Schwarzman is one of the close economic advisors for Donald Trump. And we also know that at that meeting of 24 people was Bud McFarlane, and that Bud McFarlane, right after that, in June, that meeting was on April 27th of 2016. In June, the June issue of the National Interest, which is the magazine for that group, that Bud McFarlane wrote a major article in which he stated, as I told you, that Russia will become an integral partner of the United States in ensuring the energy security of the Western world. And so that this echoes very much of two things that I pointed out to you. One of them is this major article that was written by Samuel P. Huntington. Samuel P. Huntington was the editor of the Foreign Affairs magazine for the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, in which he wrote this major article called The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order. And what he proposed is that Russia and the United States and the other Caucasian countries of the West should all get together and form a major new alliance against China and what he called the new Asian empire that will be rising in the second half of the 21st century, all under the hegemony of China. And that therefore, if we're going to forestall China becoming the dominant power in the world, which of course is our job from their point of view, we have to combine together and get over all of this multiculturalism, all of these kind of multiple diverse religions and toleration of all these different religions and different ethnic groups, etc., in return to the basic white Christian male-dominated culture that made us great before. Even under the point of suggesting that rather than just become a Christian coalition, it should be Catholic. Okay, and that therefore they're espousing that the Russian Orthodox Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church come back into union with the Roman Rite of the Catholic Church, and that they become the dominant religion, and so that you have a full culture with the same religion, the same racial makeup, the minority groups be spun off to the extent to which they could. I'm telling you, this is downright frightening, because Samuel P. Huntington, at the time he wrote that article, and later the much longer book of the same title, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, he was in fact the president of the American Academy of Political Science. And he was the editor-in-chief of Foreign Affairs magazine, the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was the ranking Harvard University scholar on international relations. So, I mean, this is not a small thing that we're talking about here. And I pointed out to you that this same ethos was reflected in I mentioned the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document that was drafted right at the end of the Cold War. As soon as the Cold War ended at the end of 1991, December 31st of 1991, there was a set of meetings that took place in the West Wing of the White House under the George Bush Sr. administration, under the aegis of his Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, and his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, and Scooter Libby, and Doug Fife, and David Addington, and Elliot Abrams. And they had a meeting in which they actually drafted up a 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document, openly, secretly actually, but flagrantly advocating the establishment of full spectrum dominance on the part of the United States over the entire planet, so that we could assert our military power and superiority over any other nation state or any other non-state actor on the planet. And that the only thing that changed in that, after it leaked out that what they were planning, that George Bush Sr. And Theodore Shackley, his director of covert operations when he was the director of the CIA from 1975 to 1977, they co-authored a second iteration of that, in which they just shifted from having it be unilaterally undertaken on the part of the United States to undertaking it on a multilateral level with the United States, Canada, Mexico, under the dominance of the PRI, the Castilian Spanish party in Mexico, the UK, France, Italy, Spain, in the new reunified Germany now at the end of the Cold War, and Russia, if they were willing to participate in this. Russia, now that it had spun off all of its ethnic provinces, is the exact quote. And so it's perfectly evident what it is that they're doing there. They're basically following out the same scenario as was being recommended by Samuel Huntington. Yes, Grant?
So that's a quote from the 1992
United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance. That was the second iteration of it.
So there was an ethnic emphasis in that policy.
Directly. I mean, that is the quote. That Russia could be invited to come in now to participate in this new Northern Industrial Alliance now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces. And they specifically pointed out, to get back to the core point here, that the purpose of this new Northern Industrial Alliance would be to maintain the continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by the member states of this new Northern Industrial Alliance. And that is oil. And that goes all the way back. And that's why I'd recommended to you that you might get a look at the book called The Prize, that actually lays out the whole history of the concomitant rise of oil as the basis of power, military power, engineering the military in the rise of capitalism in Western civilization. That's the key to this thing, and that's why that when you know all of that stuff and you see the footprints in the snow here that we see in front of us of this meeting on April 27th, and the personnel that were there, in the sale of this this former Russian-owned company, and you see that the major portion of the wealth that was owned by that company is in fact off the Arctic shelf in the 15-mile economic zone of Russia that requires further global climate change to start melting off more and more of that ice so they can get at the 87 billion barrels of oil and the 30% of all of the natural gas on the planet, which they value at some $10 trillion. And so the question of who this secret partner is in the ownership now, the private ownership of that former Russian national oil and gas company is critical. Because if Trump is part of that alliance and Putin is part of that alliance privately, then that answers the question. And it answers the question not only of why they would be having this peculiar love affair and be meeting in secret with no one else available to talk with them or understand what they're talking about, but also why it is that Donald Trump, in the face of all of the overwhelming evidence, keeps on saying there's no such thing as global climate change, and keeps on insisting upon doubling and quadrupling the amount of oil and natural gas that is put into production in the world, so that the Western powers can dominate the world and keep China from taking over and deprive China of the oil. And at the same time, China is now, as you may know, threatening to build 30 million new electric cars so that they can, in fact, cut into the demand for oil in the world to try to undermine what it is that the Western powers are trying to do here. Okay? So that this is the strategic play that is going on, and it is something that the regular leadership of both the Republican and Democratic parties are going to try to keep secret. Because this process of getting access and control over the petroleum on the planet has been going on as a shared mission on the part of the Republican and Democratic Party, ever since the end of World War I. And you can see that again in that book, The Prize, where they talk about this. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to point out to you that this type of a deep, dark secret that's going on at the base of this conflict that is taking place between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party now, the so-called Hamiltonian Party of the Republicans, of the financiers and the bankers and the industrialists and the capitalists, and on the other hand, the Madisonians that are more regional and local in their scope and not as dedicated to the mercantile industry, that these types of confrontations almost always are concealing some deeper source of the conflict that is going on. And that's what we have happening here. And so what I did is I started out last Thursday explaining to you the deeper story behind the Watergate burglary. That the fact, as I pointed out to you, is that the Republican and Democratic Party, that is Nixon in the Eisenhower administration, running the covert operations for the 5412 Committee, the National Security Council, in creating this political assassination operation going on around the world that was known about by Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, both together, mounting this Vietnam War, in maintaining the Vietnam War, John F. Kennedy was in the process of trying to withdraw U.S. military forces from Vietnam. But Lyndon Johnson and Nixon both, in the Republican and Democratic Party at that time, the regular traditional Democratic Party, that was rooted in Houston and in Texas, in the oil corporations down there. That element of the Democratic Party, they were all devoted to supporting the war in Vietnam, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to get a military foothold into Asia. That it was the same reason that they invaded the Korean Peninsula, is to try to get a land base in there. And so they were trying to get a land base closer to China, and so that they set up this completely artificial entity of South Vietnam that never existed at all, and fabricated this country, and brought in a graduate student from Columbia University, Neo Dinh Diem, and put him in charge, and said, "Oh, now there's a new democratic government in South Vietnam." And The reason I'm raising all of this is because what I'm asserting to you is that it was the Vietnam War that undermined Richard Nixon. It wasn't just that he obstructed justice. I mean, they do that all the time. And it wasn't just that he burglarized people's offices. They do that all the time. But the really fundamental thing is that he had lost his ability to govern because of this fundamental conflict that was going on in the war in Vietnam. And that the people were marching in the streets, an entire generation was rising up against him. They were starting to resort to violence by forming the Weathermen and the Black Panther Party and others. And a larger and larger percentage of the intelligentsia in the university communities around the country were starting to sympathize with the need to take radical action, even unto the application of violence, mostly anti-materiel violence, but that they were engaged in that type of a process, and they were pushing the country to the brink of civil war. And that's what was really going on. So beneath the weakening of Richard Nixon, in fact, they just had a debate that was going on last Thursday, I guess it was, Thursday evening, that they were talking about the comparison between the Watergate scandal in the ultimate prepared impeachment of Richard Nixon and Trump right now. And two of the commentators actually said, well, the real reason for that was Richard Nixon. As soon as the Pentagon Papers were published, the whole bottom started falling out of the Vietnam War. The whole legitimacy of the war in Vietnam started to collapse with the revelation of the Pentagon Papers. And so Richard Nixon was losing his power base because it turns out that the protesters against the Vietnam War ended up being shown to be telling the truth, that this is not a championing of democratic principles in South Vietnam. It's not an attempt to go to the aid of some poor defenseless country that's being overrun by communists from the north. This is a blatant set of imperialist activities. And it showed in the Pentagon Papers that Lyndon Johnson had totally fabricated the Bay of Tonkin resolution, and it put false information in front of the Congress to get the Tonkin resolution from Congress that he used to justify sending 500,000 U.S. military troops into Southeast Asia. And it revealed the existence of heroin trafficking, opium trafficking, political assassination programs, etc. And all of this stuff is revealed in the Pentagon Papers. And by that time, Richard Nixon had come to basically own that war. And because of that, the entire threat of the splitting of the country was right at the doorstep of Richard Nixon. And so when Richard Nixon got caught doing these other things, he didn't have the kind of political support that would be necessary to fight off an impeachment process like that. And so that what I'm saying here is that what I'm trying to point out is that the analogy here to the Trump impeachment process is the issue of global climate change. Is that the fact of the matter is that the world now is being confronted with the phenomenon of global climate change, and it is in fact the massive burning of petroleum in fossil fuels that is the proximate causation of the global climate change. And if in fact we can show that Donald Trump is directly involved with Putin in the biggest oil sale in the history of the human family, here right in the face of global climate change, it is the kind of discovery that could drop the complete bottom out of his support. And that's the reason I'm raising this now. And I don't want to go way off giving you huge amount of detail, which I'm tempted to do, but I'm trying to control myself, of all kinds of information about the Watergate burglary and similar information about the Iran-Contra scandal. As you know, I was directly involved in both of them. That I was in the law firm of F. Lee Bailey, where we were representing James McCord, who was the Watergate burglar, who was the wiretap specialist for the Central Intelligence Agency. It was our office that got him to write the letter to Judge Sirica, blowing the whistle on Richard Nixon and the plumbers unit. So I was there, firsthand witness to the disintegration of the Nixon administration, and had been asked by Chuck Morgan, the director of the National Office of the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington, to actually write the original draft for the articles of impeachment for Richard Nixon. So I was there when all of that was going on and was privy to the kind of information which I've shared with you earlier about what it is that was really going on there. That it all came back to the discovery of the check in Bernard Barker's pocket that was not only representing funds that had in fact originated with CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President, and found in the pocket of the burglar, which was enough, of course, to get rid of him. But in fact, it was drafted on the bank of the Banco Internacional in Mexico City, on the bank account of the lawyer, Manuel Ogario, which was the same bank account into which the money was put that was skimmed off the casinos by the mob out in Vegas and deposited in the Miami National Bank, and then it was wired into the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, and a whole fund was set up down in Mexico City where they were financing the political assassination team that was assigned to kill Fidel Castro. It was that very bank account from which the check came that was in Bernard Barker's pocket. And it was the fact that Mark Felt, the number 2 man in the FBI, was on June 24th of 1972 scheduled to fly out of Washington, D.C. to go down to Mexico City to investigate that particular bank account that was freaking them all out. And that's when Pat Gray called the White House and talked to John Dean and told him that, look, I've got the FBI is out from under my control. Mark Felt is getting ready to fly out tomorrow to go down to investigate this bank account down in Mexico City where the check came from. And Pat Gray was asking John Dean to go talk to Nixon and find out if that's going to cause any trouble. And that's what happened. John Dean came and talked to Bob Haldeman, told him what was getting ready to happen. Haldeman comes in to talk to Richard Nixon, and then there's the famous conversation, the smoking gun conversation. And it was the investigation of the bank, the attempt on the part of Mark Felt to go down and investigate the bank in that account that caused Richard Nixon to freak out. And he said, you got to stop it right now. Stop that part of the investigation right now. So Bob Haldeman, you go over and get John Ehrlichman, and you both go over across the river to the agency and see Dick Helms and Vernon Walters and have them contact Pat Gray, the new head of the FBI, and tell them to get the hell out of that part of the investigation right now. And Bob Haldeman said to him, well, what am I supposed to say to him? What am I supposed to tell him? Well, you tell them if they don't get out of that part of the investigation right now, all the Mexico stuff about the Bay of Pigs guys could all come out. And he started talking about the Bay of Pigs guys right then. And he said, well, E. Howard Hunt, if you pull that scab, there's going to be an awful lot of stuff under there that is going to cause lots of trouble. Well, that's because E. Howard Hunt was in fact part of the assassination team to kill the president. And that's exactly why Bob Haldeman, as I mentioned to you before, when he was being questioned about this by Sam Ervin and Dan Inouye, the senator from North Carolina and the senator from Hawaii, in the Watergate hearings, when he was being questioned about that, and he was asked, well, when Bob Haldeman said, what am I supposed to tell him? And Nixon said, you tell them that. You tell them that. And Sam Ervin said to him, well, what was it they were talking about? What was it they were talking about? And Bob Haldeman said, I think they were talking about the assassination of President Kennedy. And he said it just like that. And that was the moment when our country had the opportunity to follow that out, because it popped its head right to the surface like that, but everybody just stood silent for like 30 seconds and said nothing to follow up on it, and just turned around and went on to a completely different subject. So that whole nest, and what that is that what it was showing is that the American Central Intelligence Agency that had been created in 1947 at the end of World War II had in fact come to full fruition and full flower in exactly the wrong way, like people had predicted that it might. You cannot set up, these were the opponents of the creation of the CIA in 1947. You cannot create an organization like that has the authority abroad to violate laws and engage in completely illegal activity and political overthrows of governments. You can't do that because it will come home to roost. And that is exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. That the Central Intelligence Agency became deeply involved in putting together that assassination team, at the request of Richard Nixon, who asked Howard Hughes to do it. But Howard Hughes' lawyer, Bob Mayhew, went and talked with Johnny Roselli there in Las Vegas, who was the bag man for the mafia, and asked them if they would, in fact, put together the assassination team to kill Castro so that it could keep it away from the White House, so no one would know about it. But when they did that, Trafficante was a smart guy, and he, in fact, brought guys on to run the assassination team who are now working for the Central Intelligence Agency that had fled from Cuba back in 1959 in January when Batista was overthrown. And they'd come up to Tampa and Miami and had been recruited to work in Operation 40 of the CIA under Richard Nixon to try to undermine the Cuban new revolutionary government. And so he knew perfectly well that if they got caught assassinating Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, or the other 5 comandantes, then if they got caught, then the CIA would have to move in to cover for them and conceal that and keep them from being convicted because they were associated with the CIA. And nobody would believe that it wasn't the CIA that was in charge of doing that. So that was the underlying deep sin. It was that the Central Intelligence Agency had in fact come out from under control, just like was feared. But the deeper story of that is that the Central Intelligence Agency was deeply in league with the fascists that had escaped from Europe at the end of World War II through the rat line, and had come down into Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay, and they were deeply involved with the Central Intelligence Agency in overthrowing the democratically elected governments in South America. And so there was a deep and abiding alliance between them, which, again, I could go on and on about that, and it's turtles all the way down. It gets you all the way down to a point where what I'll do is I'll come back around to that later, but what I want to do right now is tell you what the deep story was beneath the Iran-Contra scandal that was similar to that, because the whole explosion of the Iran-Contra scandal was rooted in a deep secret that both the Democrats and Republicans wanted to keep concealed. And the secret was this, that I told you 2 classes ago that when we filed the Iran-Contra complaint under the Federal Criminal Racketeering Act, the civil provisions of that, we filed that lawsuit on a Thursday evening of May 28th of 1986 down in Miami. And I told you that by Monday morning, I got the call from Judge James Lawrence King demanding that I come down immediately to the courtroom and be down there by 2 o'clock. I told you that story of the 26 lawyers all sitting there, and the one who was going to be representing Adolfo Calero, the head of the FDN-Contras, was in fact the former CIA general counsel under George H.W. Bush, and Anthony Lapham. That was he. And that the lawyer that was going to be representing the Tamiami gun shop, that Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., that the lawyer that was representing him had been the head of the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office until the previous Friday night at 5 o'clock. That demonstration of the fact that they were locking down, the national security state was going to lock down and prevent us from getting at the evidence to show what was really going on. I told you that when I came back from that meeting and came back up to my office and came into the office on Tuesday morning or Monday morning, that I'd gone to see Tip O'Neill and that I'd gone to see Claiborne Pell, and that we got the agreement set up a special select committee to investigate the charges that we were making if the Democrats were to win the election again. Same exact thing we're hearing right now. I told you that Tip O'Neill said, well, the Democrats were in charge of the House of Representatives right now, and so we could get an articles of impeachment returned against Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Bill Casey and and probably a dozen other high-level executives of the administration, but it won't do any good because the Republicans control the Senate now, and they would never convict them. So we're going to have to wait to see if the Democrats can take back the Senate in November, which is directly analogous to what the argument is that's being made by the Democratic Party now. No, it's not going to do any good to impeach him in the House now because the Republicans control the Senate and won't convict him. So let's wait to see if we can win the election. Same exact argument they made. And so we went along with that. But when I came back from striking that deal and coming back to the office, I told you this older man was waiting for me, who was waiting there in the office. And when I told him that I thought Theodore Shackley was the most important of all of our 26 defendants, and when he asked me, why was that, I told him it wasn't because he was the director of covert operations and was the boss of the Donald P. Gregg, who was that's getting too complicated now, I can tell. But the bottom line is that I got done with that meeting. He introduced himself, and he said, here, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I think we can help each other out. That's where I ended the story a week ago. But I want to tell you what the key is what happened immediately after that. He said to me, look, there's a guy that wants to meet you. Would you be willing to meet with him even if you don't know who it is to start with? And I said, yes. And he said, when would you be able to meet with him? And I said, well, how about tomorrow for lunch? And he said, okay. He said, and where would you like to meet so you'll feel comfortable? I felt like Michael Corleone. They're going to take me down to Louis, where I'd feel comfortable. Anyway, so I told him, I said, let's do it at the Dubliner Cafe, right down at the bottom of Capitol Hill here. So he said, all right. So the next morning, or at lunch, 12 o'clock, I go over to the Dubliner Cafe, and here's Dick Billings waiting for me outside. I walk up and shake his hand. We walk in, and there's this like 70-year-old guy sitting in there all by himself in the Dubliner Cafe. We walk in, and Dick Billings walks me over to the guy, and he says, Dan Sheehan? He says, Joe Smith. Joe Smith, Dan Sheehan. So I shook his hand, and I said, yeah, great, Joe Smith. And he said, no. He says, I get that a lot. He said, my name is Joseph Burkholder Smith. I was the deputy CIA station chief down in Mexico City back in 1973 when Theodore Shackley was taken out from being the CIA station chief in Saigon and made the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA. And when he came on board as the director of Western Hemisphere operations, he removed all of the station chiefs all throughout the Western Hemisphere and put his own men in that position. He was arguing that Phil Agee was in the process of writing this book called Inside the Company, and that he might have gotten the list of who the station chiefs were, and he didn't want them compromised, so he used that as an excuse for replacing all the station chiefs with his men. And so he took out Win Scott, who was the CIA station chief, my station chief here in Mexico City, and he replaced him with a fellow by the name of Tom Polgar. And Tom Polgar came into my office as soon as he got on station, and he came in, he said, Joe, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to keep you on as my deputy here. But there's going to be a guy who's going to come into your office tomorrow about 10 o'clock in the morning. You'll recognize who he is, he said, and he's going to ask you some questions. Now, you don't have to answer his questions, but if you do and you answer them correctly, then that may have a lot to do with whether I'm going to keep you on as my deputy. And he might even have some other people that want to ask some questions. It's up to you. But if you want to keep your position here, you might want to go and talk to him. So the next day, he said, I'm sitting here talking to this guy. Now, here's Joseph Burkholder Smith sitting at the table with me. Dick Billings is sitting over here, and he's telling me the story. And he said, so the next morning, he said, into my office at about 10 o'clock walks Nasser Haro, who is the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the combined FBI and CIA. And he walks into my office, and he says, Joe, I imagine that Polgar told you that I'd be coming to see you. And Joe said, well, he didn't tell me who it was, but he said that I would recognize you, and I do. And so the fellow says to him, Nasser Haro says, look, there's some people who would like to ask you some questions. And you don't have to come, you don't have to answer them, but it would really determine whether or not you're going to be left on here as the deputy to the station chief. And so Joe said, so I agreed to go with him. So we leave the office, we go downstairs, we get into one of these Suburbans with the smoke tinted windows, and we drive to the Mexico City National Airport. We go completely around all the security and get in this Learjet. And we fly away in the Learjet, and we fly this whole long ways, and we end up landing in Buenos Aires in Argentina. We get out of the Learjet, and we go all around security and get into this helicopter, and we fly all the way up to the northwestern corner of Argentina, where like 5 different countries in South America all come together there. He said, and we land in this helicopter on this like soccer field in this little town called Salta. And so I get out of the helicopter, I get out behind Nasser Haro, and I'm following Nasser Haro across this soccer field, and we walk up this big embankment, and I looked over the embankment, and he said, my God, he said, I thought I was in Bavaria, he said. And I looked down, and Nasser Haro leads me down in this little town, and he leads me over to this little Bavarian inn, and we walk in, and here are these 6 guys sitting at this big oaken table in front of a big stone fireplace, and on the mantle of the fireplace is a big, huge swastika flag. Okay, now this is 1973. He said, so the guy in the middle gestures to me to sit down. There's only one chair on the other side of the table, so I sit down. And the guy says, Joe, he said, look, we got to have a talk with you here. He said, we've put in a lot of time and effort and money into setting up a major cocaine cartel down in Medellin, in Colombia. And this cocaine is going to be being shipped up into the United States, and a portion of the profits that are generated by the sale of this cocaine are going to be used to help finance our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we just wanted to make sure that if you're left on as the deputy station chief, you aren't going to do anything to interfere with that traffic. And so Joseph Burkholder Smith says to me, looks across the table, and he says, and Dan, I got to tell you, he said, I swear to God, he said, I don't know what it was that I'd ever done in my whole life that would have led them to believe I would have gone along with that. And so I said, how about being the CIA deputy station chief in Mexico City for a start? I said, he looked kind of shocked like that, and he looks over to Dick Billings, and he says, gee, I thought this guy was going to cooperate with us. And Dick Billings says, hey, look, I just met the guy. He said, and so the guy gets up, Joseph Burkholder Smith gets up, walks around the table to me, sticks his hand out, grabs my hand, looks me in the eye, and he said, I just wanted to know that if you're going to be messing with Theodore Shackley, that you know exactly who it is you're really dealing with. See that look? See that puzzled look? What does that mean? What in the world does that mean? And that's what we're going to be talking about in the course. Because what you don't know is very important here. Because what was at the root of the Iran-Contra confrontation was the fact that the power that created the Central Intelligence Agency, the very men who created the Central Intelligence Agency, were the very same people that created the Third Reich in Germany, that financed the Third Reich in Germany through setting up a bank called the Union Bank of New York that was financed by the members of a particular private investment firm that I've mentioned earlier called Brown Brothers Harriman. These robber barons that had risen to power in the United States between 1868 at the end of the American Civil War and 1898, that short 30-year period, their families who had become multimillionaires, the heads of those families were all members of this private investment firm on Wall Street by the name of Brown Brothers Harriman. And they would join together and sit around the table and decide what they were going to mutually invest their money in. And what they decided to do at the end of World War I was they were going to establish because remember, at the end of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 had come forward and had overthrown Tsar Nicholas II and had thrown out the Tsar, had withdrawn Russia from World War I, and had created the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And they, in fact, immediately, the United States Secretary of State at that time, a guy by the name of Robert, Benning, Robert, I'll think of it in a second. Anyway, this guy who was the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, he was, in fact, the son-in-law of John W. Foster. John W. Foster was the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. There's no spark of recognition in your eyes of who those people are, but the bottom line is that that the United States launched, I've talked to you about this, but launched a U.S. military expedition into Russia to try to crush the Bolshevik Revolution. They sent in a full armed expeditionary force to try to crush the Russian Revolution. And so that right from that start, there was this panic on the part of the capitalists and the robber barons who were in charge of the kind of imperial venture that was going on, all from the end of the American Revolution, the American Civil War, all the way up to the beginning of World War I. There was this huge period of imperial activity on the part of the United States, on the part of Britain, on the part of France, on the part of these other countries. It's the age of imperialism. This is a regular part of your textbooks of American history during this age of imperialism that led to World War I. And it was the Bolshevik Revolution that rose up and withdrew Russia from World War I and set themselves up as the antipode or the antithesis to this operation that was going on in Western civilization of all of these major imperial powers fighting and struggling to gain access to the resources around the world for the benefit of these robber barons. Okay? And so what happened is when World War I came to an end and they tried unsuccessfully to destroy the Bolshevik Revolution, what they did is they retreated and came back home. But these men, what they did is the partners in Brown Brothers Harriman, they decided they were going to set up a thing called the Union Bank of New York, and the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman, a man by the name of George Herbert Walker, stepped down as the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman and had his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, become the new CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman. And George Herbert Walker went over and founded the Union Bank of New York. And he had these 50 industrialists take their monies and invest in capitalizing the Union Bank of New York. And they set up a foreign subsidiary in Holland, in the Netherlands, called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce. And there was a guy named Fritz Thyssen was the head of that bank. that bank financed the construction of the international headquarters of the Third Reich in Germany, and financed the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany to function as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. That was their purpose in creating the Third Reich. And the Third Reich began to carry through with the full same theories that these people thought were the best kind of economic theory of welding together the instrumentalities of the state with the interests of the private corporations. And that is what they were doing. The private corporations, the Krupps, the ball bearing factories, the DuPonts, the chemical corporations, etc., in the IG Farben and the others in Germany, all remained in private hands and were financed hand over fist by Brown Brothers Harriman. Brown Brothers Harriman, interestingly, the lawyer for Brown Brothers Harriman was Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was a partner in the law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. And Sullivan and Cromwell were the lawyers for Brown Brothers Harriman. The lawyer they assigned to be the on-the-ground lawyer for them was Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles were the grandsons of John W. Foster, who had been the Secretary of State back in 1893, that overthrew Hawaii and Guam and the Philippine Islands. They were, that age of imperialism was underway in 1893. This guy, John W. Foster, retired as soon as Allen Dulles was born, that one of his daughters married the Dulles man, okay, and had the two children, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And John W. Foster retired and began coaching these two guys, his grandsons, to understand what imperialism was all about. In fact, Allen Dulles, when he was 8 years old, wrote a major 15-page paper justifying the Boers in South Africa, in the imperial venture in South Africa. And John W. Foster was so proud of it, he had it printed up. Had it printed as a book and used to hand it out to people. So Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles were kind of curried right from the beginning. And Robert Lansing is the guy I was trying to think of, that Robert Lansing was John W. Foster's son-in-law. That Robert Lansing married John W. Foster's oldest daughter. And he became the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. So what I'm saying is this group of people were all involved in the financing of this, because what happened is at the end of World War I, when Robert Lansing sent in the Foreign Military Expeditionary Force into Russia and failed to crush the Bolshevik Revolution, came back, and what they did is they set up the Versailles Treaty Agreement for the end of World War I. And at the Versailles Treaty negotiations, all of which were undertaken under the auspices of Robert Lansing, who was the Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had had a massive stroke and was basically incapacitated. And Robert Lansing was actually functioning as the de facto president of the United States at the end of World War I under the Wilson administration. And what he did is he brought in his two nephews, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, to be the lawyers at the Versailles Treaty negotiations. And they were the guys who actually drafted the reparations portions of the Treaty of Versailles. Yes.
So isn't it like these reparations are kind of like what tanked the German economy? They kind of led to the conditions for the creation, not some part of it. So
no. What actually these reparations are what allowed Brown Brothers Harriman to loan the money to Germany to rebuild their massive industries and their military to become the bulwark against Bolshevism. They weren't interested in trying to build democratic institutions. What they were interested in is building a huge, powerful military organization to protect Europe against Bolshevism, asserting that they were attempting to poison all of Europe with the ideas of socialism. And so what happened is that John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles not only were there at the Treaty of Versailles writing up the reparations provisions, but once they got the reparations provisions put in, Allen Dulles was made the lawyer for Germany. And he negotiated the loan agreements so that Brown Brothers Harriman, the capitalists at Brown Brothers Harriman, loaned the money to Germany to rebuild all of their military industry. And they, through the Union Bank of New York, financed the rise of the Nazi Party and built the big headquarters for the Nazi Party. And so what they were doing is coordinating the building of the Third Reich to function as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And that's what actually happened. And so when you go through the entire, you go through World War II against the Nazis, and what happened is that this was exposed, actually. It exposed that these guys were financing the Third Reich. And there was a whole set of congressional hearings, and they sealed those hearings, and they insisted that they were owning stock in all the German companies, the Krupp ball bearing factories, the IG Farben, and all those. The stocks were being held by the members of Brown Brothers Harriman. And so they were ordered to turn loose of those stocks because of the war, because they were trading with the enemy. And so what they did is they put them into an escrow account, and they hired to represent them Allen Dulles, who in fact put those things in a trust so they didn't have to give up those stocks. But all of that's just part of history. And when Roosevelt came in, Franklin Roosevelt had come in early in 1932 to 1934 and was trying to keep trying to stop the results of the Depression. These people actually choreographed an attempted military coup against Roosevelt. And these are things that you're never going to find out about if you didn't take this course. That from 1932 to 1934, there was a major attempted military coup against the United States government of Franklin Roosevelt, engineered by the partners of Brown Brothers Harriman. And the military general that they attempted to run that coup for them, General Butler, who was the commandant of the United States Marine Corps, went to Congress and told them about it. And they had a whole set of closed-door hearings in which he testified, and they sealed all the transcripts of it. And what they did is told the guys to just cut it out. Stop that. You got to stop that. We're not going to do anything to you because it would really humiliate everybody, and it would embarrass everybody, and the people in the United States wouldn't know what to think about it. And so that you just stop doing that, and we'll let you go. And that's what they did. And so that this whole group of men at the end of World War II, what they did is they had been deeply involved in maintaining the Third Reich. And what they did is they all, not all, but a lot of them participated in sneaking the leadership of the Third Reich out of Europe at the end of World War II and snuck them into South America. They're in Argentina and Brazil and Uruguay and Paraguay, and they set themselves up down there in exile. And these same people worked to set up the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency got set up to be a covert operations group that would in fact confront communism and socialism around the world. But what they were really doing is they were promoting and promulgating the issues of capitalism and state capitalism. Capitalism that was in fact the same kind of partnership between the instrumentalities of the state and the major corporations. This is the issue that we're dealing with in the United States. This is the element that created the Central Intelligence Agency, and this is the intelligence agency that got out of control, basically, and brought back home the same kind of tactics that they were authorized to use against other countries around the world to keep them from becoming socialists, and they are operational here in the United States right now. Okay, so that's why there's a deep secret here that you're not allowed to know about. And this is all this dynamic that's going on between this element and the element that is trying to establish constitutional principles, restriction of their power, the more equitable distribution of resources, not only in our country but in the world. There's this fundamental conflict going on between these two groups, and that's what you see underlying here. In that the progressive elements in the Democratic Party, the new Justice Democrats, represent the Madisonians to try to push these people back. Yes?
When you say like the CIA is kind of like out of control and operating within kind of the bounds of our country, was that then, or do you still like think that's happening now?
There isn't any reason why they would have stopped. That they, as I said, in 1980, they're the ones that brought in the money to knock off Frank Church, who headed the Church Committee that investigated their abuses, and knocked off Dick Clark of Iowa, knocked off Birch Bayh in Indiana, and tried to get Alan Cranston in California, and tried to get George McGovern in South Dakota. They had 5 of them targeted, but they brought in millions and millions of dollars of money that had been skimmed off the drug trade in the Southeast Asia to try to overthrow them. Now, I know this is an awful lot to absorb, and so what we want to do is when we get together on Thursday, I want to just sort of settle all of this stuff for you, so that we can then turn our attention to what the potential relationship is between the global climate change crisis that we're confronting and the real potential for getting Trump successfully impeached. And we can't hinge it all simply on whether or not we can prove that Trump and Putin are partners in this intertrust group, this secret group that we don't know who is in it yet. That is a great potential to look at, and we're in the process of looking at that now in our office to figure out who that is, and we will let you know as soon as we know whether or not this is they. But we have to try to figure out what we can do as American citizens to overcome this, but we need to understand that it's not something that has happened just under Trump. It's not something that's just happened under the Bushes. It's not something that just happened, since Ronald Reagan. This is a fundamental underlying dynamic in the American body politic. This element, these financiers and industrialists and mercantilists are trying to control and run the government because they do not trust the basic people. Okay, and the fact of the matter is, it's an open question as to whether or not we, as the regular people, have the capacity to govern ourselves and directly in the face of this information. Because if we can peel away the secrecy and reveal it to our people, we still have to mobilize and do something about it. And that's what the purpose of this course is about. Okay? So I don't want to keep you any longer, but I appreciate your time. And I'll see you on Thursday. Okay?